নমস্কার, welcome to all রাষ্ট্রবিজ্ঞান চর্চা কেন্দ্র. Today, I organized an international webinar on fall of Roman Empire and its lessons for contemporary world, organized by রাষ্ট্রবিজ্ঞান চর্চা কেন্দ্র, Chairperson Professor Pradip Basu, Speaker Professor Bryan Ward-Perkins. I have request Professor Pradip Basu. Sir, please chair and continue in this class.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Advocate Prakash Chakraborty and political science student Shantana Shao, and also Professor Shomiran Das, Advocate Payal Das, Oyon Thakur and others belonging to the academic platform Rashtrobigyan Chorcha Kendro, Political Science Study Center. I feel very honored that they have asked me to chair this session and chair the session of a very senior, reputed scholar, Professor Bryan Ward-Perkins. This organization is only 3 years old from 2020, that is after the corona, COVID. They started these online sessions. More than 300 webinars and seminars have been organized by them. A large number have been organized in Bengali language, which is a rare instance. And because we were a British colony and our higher education is very much tilted towards English, but still they have taken up this initiative. Mainly from West Bengal, the audience, but also from other constituent states of India and also a few from abroad come under the audience. They not only organize academic sessions, but also they help the poor students of remote villages and districts of West Bengal, helping them financially, also with books, clothes, etc. Free coaching, especially for UGC NET exam. And just today they organized one free medical camp, and 200 people of Purulia district have taken part in it, have been benefited. This is the history, very briefly, of Rashtrobigyan Chorcha Kendro. For myself, I retired from Presidency University Political Science Department, and now I come to Professor Bryan Ward-Perkins. I just want to introduce him very briefly. Bryan Ward-Perkins is a historian who taught at Oxford University, specializing in the period of late antiquity, that is approximately 300 to 800 CE, that means AD, conventionally AD, which saw the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of both Christianity and Islam. Dr. Bryan is the author of the book The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization. And his present talk, will explain why the economic collapse that followed the end of Roman rule still has relevance for the modern world. And today's topic is fall of Roman Empire, fall of the Roman Empire, and its lessons for contemporary world. And very briefly, I would say for our Bengali audience, a few things about the Romans, ancient Romans. Present Italy was once known more or less roughly as the Roman kingdom or Roman Empire, and some certain milestones I will mention. Before that, I would like to point out that in ancient European history, we find there were the Greek civilization. There was the Greek civilization, and there were small city states like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Syracuse, Megina, etc. We have already heard the names of Athens and Sparta. They were small city states called polity, and this experience enriched the Western civilization, and the Greeks gave emphasis on morality and justice. In contrast, then came the Roman Empire, a vast, huge empire in place of the small city states of the Greeks. And it was a very big territory under its jurisdiction, and administration was highly sophisticated. There were several new governmental structures and institutions. And if the Greeks were known for their contribution to justice and morality, the Romans are known for their contribution to a huge administration and the concepts of law and order, especially order and unity and jurisprudence, law. Even in Indian law, we find several terms which are Latin in origin. Uh, then the vast Roman Empire collapsed finally in 476 AD, and then the a peculiar situation emerged, which is known as the Middle Ages. At the last phase came feudalism. And then during the Renaissance in the 14th century, we come across Western modernity, gradually culminating into European Enlightenment of the 18th century. And today people talk about postmodernism. Anyway, we are not going into that. Certain milestones in 509 BC, Roman monarchy was overthrown and Roman Republic, the Republic of Rome, was established. We know the names of Spartacus and his revolt, the slave revolt. This revolt began in 73 BC, and his forces were defeated in 71 BC. After a generation, the Roman Republic, fell into civil war again in 49 BC between Julius Caesar and Pompey. We very much know the name of Julius Caesar, especially because of Shakespeare's play. And then he Despite his victory and appointment as dictator for life, Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. And Caesar's heir Octavian and Lieutenant Mark Antony defeated the assassins in 42 BC. But there was a conflict between Octavian and Antony. And Antony was defeated, and his lover Cleopatra, the famous Egyptian queen Cleopatra, both were defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And then Octavian was made the first Roman emperor as Augustus in 27 BC. So in 27 BC, the Roman Republic marked its end. Then the Roman Empire. We will listen to Professor Bryan about this empire, the causes of its failure, and the lessons it left for contemporary world. The Goths, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths attacked the Roman Empire, and there was internal strife, factionalism, corruption, economic crisis. Several factors were there. And in 476 AD, Germanic barbarian king Odoacer deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire in Italy, Romulus Augustulus. And the Senate sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Emperor Zeno. Actually, Roman Empire was considered as divided into two: the Western, the capital of which was Rome, and the Eastern, the capital of which was Constantinople. And in 1453, there was the fall of Constantinople by Ottoman Empire, and from 1453, many scholars have mentioned has indicated that there was already the Renaissance taking place. And just 2-3 words about late antiquity, because our guest professor Bryan Ward-Perkins, he specialized in late antiquity. Late antiquity is sometimes defined as the period from end of classical antiquity to the local start of the Middle Ages. That is from 3rd century to 8th century in Europe and adjacent areas bordering the Mediterranean basin. And historian Peter Brown mentioned that it should be 150 to 750 AD. And the Oxford Center for Late Antiquity defined it as the period between 250 and 750 AD. And our Professor Bryan mentioned it as 300 AD to 800 AD. That's all in brief. I request our very honorable guest, Professor Bryan Ward-Perkins, to start his lecture.
Thank you, Professor Basu. That's a very kind introduction. And I was delighted to receive this invitation because speaking to an audience in Bengal and wider India, I cannot imagine a nicer thing to be doing. I've only visited India once, but I thought it was unbelievably wonderful. And it is the place I most want to return to in the whole world. So thank you very much for that introduction. I've slightly changed my title to The Fall of the Western Roman Empire and a Lesson for the Modern World. So what I'm going to be talking about is what happens in the Western Roman Empire after it is invaded and disintegrates into a series of individual states. Now, the Western Roman Empire, if you're looking at the slide, is everything on the left-hand side of the screen, all that blue stuff in Africa and in Italy and in the Balkans, and everything to the west of that, so including modern France, modern Spain, and the south of Britain. In fact, as we've already been told, I mean, this does essentially collapse in the 5th and 6th century. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, because it is invaded by people who are now called the Germanic peoples, a series of tribes from the east and north of Europe. This little map here shows you how complicated it is, and that is a very simplified map. It's a chaotic period in the 5th and 6th century with these various tribes entering the empire, often fighting each other as much as they were fighting the Romans, and with the Romans often divided amongst themselves, fighting civil wars and allying with various Germanic tribes. Much debated about why this happened. I'm not actually going to be talking about that, but what I'm going to be talking about is the consequences of the chaos that happened in the 5th and 6th century. Because it's my belief, and the belief of most people who work with archaeological material, that there is a dramatic economic recession. I would say more than a recession, an economic collapse, and that this is a collapse which takes the Western Roman Empire back to an economic level deep in prehistory. And that's what I'm going to be exploring in this talk. Now, most people will accept that there was change at the end of the Roman Empire, particularly that the power of the state declined. That is indubitable, and that with the decline of the state, there was a change in terms of the sort of level of sophistication in terms of building and production, because the state was able to do extraordinary things. Next slide. Okay. Yes, for instance, if we take this building in Rome, which is the Pantheon, one of the great temples of Rome, built in the early 2nd century AD. I'm afraid on the slides I've put CE, Common Era, but AD is exactly the same as CE. In this building, if you look at the columns at the front, those are huge monoliths of granite. They're made out of single, undivided blocks of stone. That granite came from high up in the Egyptian desert, quarried at immense difficulty, because granite is an extremely tough material, and obviously they're not using modern technology. Quarried up there, dragged down to the Nile, difficult feat in itself, floated on the Nile to the delta of the Nile, put onto boats, taken to Ostia, the port of Rome, and then put onto barges again to take it up to the city of Rome and erected here. And I mean, extraordinary achievements achieved by the Roman state. But not just that, that whole building is built of hundreds of thousands of bricks. And the state, again, has been able to mobilize people to produce all of those bricks. This is in the early 2nd century. And certain areas of the empire, the privileged areas, I mean, benefited hugely from imperial effort. The next slide. I mean, for example, Rome was provided with fresh water from the mountains around, which is brought in along immensely long aqueducts, some of them high level, like this one, the Aqua Traiana of the early 2nd century. The aqueduct channel is at the top. The arches are merely supporting that aqueduct channel so that the water is flowing at the right gradient, because obviously you can't take, in this period, you can't really take water uphill. You have to build these great aqueducts in order to get it into the city at the right levels. And the next slide. And the empire is not only providing people in Rome with water, it's also providing them with basics like olive oil. If you ever go to Rome, do visit this site. It's a place called Monte Testaccio, which literally means pottery mountain. And that hill, and you can see the size of it in comparison to the modern buildings around, is an entirely artificial hill made up of broken amphorae, which are the pottery containers in which they transported olive oil from Spain to Rome. Is 100% made up of broken bits of amphorae, millions and millions and millions of them, constituting this huge rubbish dump on the edge of the city of Rome. So nobody doubts that the Roman Empire was able to do things which are remarkable, but it has become fashionable in modern historiography to doubt whether the fall of the empire had an effect really lower down society other than the very privileged people who benefited from imperial effort. And this is what I wrote a book about in 2005. I'm now actually working in a completely different area, but because you're political scientists, I thought I would go back to this topic. I mean, I'm now working on Christian saints who are perhaps slightly less interesting. So I've come back to this topic to give this talk. And in that book, I argued that there is a dramatic economic collapse. But first of all, what we need to look at in the first part of my talk is the nature of the Roman economy. The evidence you're going to see is going to be archaeological, not documentary. This is for a very straightforward reason. I mean, the Romans produced lots and lots and lots of documents that would provide us with economic data had they survived, but they simply have not survived, except in Egypt, where papyri actually survive in the soil because Egypt is so dry. Essentially, we do not have written documentation for the Roman economy. But fortunately, we have wonderful archaeological data. The reason for that is because in Europe, people have been excavating sites for 100, 150 years with great sophistication and publishing them. And there are literally tens of thousands of Roman sites that have been excavated and published in Europe. Archaeological data isn't perfect, it's far from perfect, partly because it can only document stuff that survives in the soil. And some things don't survive in the soil, in particular, organic material. So, for example, woolen clothing, leather shoes, or wooden tools generally do not survive. But fortunately, no, do what that next slide now. Fortunately, some things survive extremely well, in particular, pottery. A piece of pot breaks very easily, but once it's broken, it's almost indestructible. And there are millions and millions and millions of pieces of Roman pot lying around waiting to be excavated. Now, pottery, fortunately, is also very instructive. If you look at the slide, the photo top left on the screen, that is a 1st century AD pot from a kiln in the south of modern south of France. If you look at the pot, you can see immediately, just from looking at it, the level of technology that's gone into it. This has been thrown on a fast wheel. So it's produced, first of all, the clay has been very carefully selected in order to make sure it's high quality and can take a good finish. It's then been thrown on a fast wheel to produce this very smooth, regular look. It's been fired, effectively fired in a kiln to give it the hardness that's required. It's then been covered in a very fine slip, a gloss slip, and it's been fired again to give it this red, shiny finish. So just looking at the pot, you get some idea of the levels of technology that go into making a Roman pot. But we also have much more information from pots, particularly if we happen to have excavated the kiln sites themselves. And this kiln site at this place in modern France called La Gros-Fazenc has been excavated. And in fact, the slide top left is in that pot has been used to make a list. That is a list with naming individual potters, the number of pots they've made, and it is assumed correctly that this is a list of a vast kiln in which individual potters provided their pots and they had a communal kiln in order to fire them, a kiln that was capable of firing hundreds of potters at a time. The picture on the right is a pit that's been excavated at La Gros-Fazenc. We're looking down into the pit and it's full of 10,000 plus discarded bits of pottery, many of them completely whole. Now, the explanation is that those pieces of pot have slight defects. For instance, the glaze hasn't worked perfectly, or maybe the pot is slightly distorted in the kiln. And what's happening is they're discarding these pots in order to maintain the quality of the products that came out of the La Gros-Fazenc kiln site. I mean, this is a remarkably sophisticated world in which they are carefully monitoring and maintaining quality. And then the picture bottom left, La Gros-Fazenc is the red dot in the south of France, or the big red dot. All the other dots are places where pottery from La Gros-Fazenc has been found. Unfortunately, Roman pottery, because it's very distinctive from different kiln sites, it's easy to tell where it's come from. So a piece of pot excavated in the north of England, for example, can readily be recognized as a piece of La Gros-Fazenc pottery if it looks right. And furthermore, if there's any doubt about where the pot came from, you can do a petrological analysis. You look at the clay, you analyze what the inclusions are in terms of minerals, and then that will pinpoint a specific site where only that clay with those inclusions can be found. So from pottery, we get an idea of the sophistication of the production process, and then a remarkable picture about the distribution that's involved. And in the Roman world, there were giant pottery producers like La Gros-Fazenc, but there were also, Santana, what I'll do is I'll raise my hand when I need the next slide, if that's clear. Next slide. There were also lots of what you might call regional producers. For example, in Britain, top right, all of those lozenges that you can see are major regional producers of pottery in the 3rd and 4th century. And the slide on and the picture on the left shows one of these, which its pot's called Oxford ware because it's made just outside modern Oxford. And the black dots show the distribution of Oxford ware. And the picture bottom right is an Oxford ware pot. It's very like the stuff from La Gros-Fazenc. It's made on a fast wheel from well-selected clay. It's been fired once. It's then been glossed. And in this case, it's also been painted over the gloss. And then it's been fired again. Roman pottery production shows a wide range of highly functional and indeed attractive wares, which were made in quantity so that they were widely available. Next slide. We know this particularly from graves. Fortunately, the Romans had the habit of burying their dead with grave goods. So we know that individuals owned particular objects. These pots from a Roman cemetery in southern Britain near Winchester are very typical of what you find in these cemeteries. These are not rich graves. These are graves of fairly ordinary people. And what you can see is that they have access to very good quality pottery. There are some remarkable modern touches in this pottery production. Next slide. This is an aspect I like particularly. All these pieces of pot are made by different potters in Italy in the 1st century AD. All of them, you can probably just see this, have a stamp in the middle of the base of the pot, which has the name of the potter, so that people buying this knew what they were buying. And these are stamps that are certainly made in order to tell you you are buying a high quality pot from this particular potter and you should be proud of this. The stamps are not put on the bottoms of the pot, which might be part of a factory process. They're actually put on the top so that purchasers could see these and appreciate them. So far, what we've looked at are tablewares, and tablewares are the nice pots that were made to be handled and enjoyed on the table and to be put into one's grave. But it's also true that the Romans made massive quantities of purely functional pottery. Next slide. Cooking pots and storage jars. And these amphorae in which they maintained their liquids. This is a site in Egypt, Antinopolis, and you're looking out over a Roman period rubbish dump. And what you're seeing is the vast masses of really very ordinary pots that have been discarded in Antinopolis. Next slide. That's showing you a detail. It's very good quality. It's not got any pretensions, but functionally, it's extremely good. I mean, this material will take cooking on a fire. It will also store liquids extremely effectively. I talked a lot about pots. And in fact, some people have sometimes accused me of being over interested in pots. But actually, I think pots are very, very good wider indicators because you cannot make money making an individual functional pot. You can only make money by making thousands of them. So if you have an industry that is making good quality pots, it must be that there is a substantial market and a market structure for distributing them. And I think pots are a good sign of other industries which we know very little about. I mean, for instance, clothing or footwear. I mean, the fact that the Romans had access to extremely high quality pottery, for me, that shows that they actually had access to very high quality other objects. We can show this, in fact, in the case of a few other objects. In my book, I discuss brick and tile. Even an ordinary Roman farmstead in the countryside might well be made of brick and have a tile roof. And we can also show it in the case of iron. Next slide. That's jumped one. We do know that the Romans had lots of iron. This, in fact, is an exceptional case here. These are nails which were buried by the Roman army in southern Scotland, in North Britain. What had happened is that the army had gone up into Scotland to try and defeat the Scots, and they'd built a fort. and they'd built the fort with wooden planks banged together with nails. They then retreat in 86 AD, and they dismantle their fort, and they pull out all the nails, and they bury them deep underground so the Scots couldn't get hold of them after they'd left. Why they didn't take them with them is obscure, but they bury them. And from this fort, from this one pit, about 1 million nails have been recovered. I mean, it shows, production on a scale which is truly impressive. That's obviously for the army, and you could say that's the state operating, which it obviously is. But the thing that, as I said, I'd like to emphasize about the Roman Empire is it isn't just the state. This kind of level of production in terms of quantity and quality and sophistication is also there in the market, in the free market. So that, for instance, as I said, a peasant in the countryside might well have a tiled roof. He'd probably have some imported pottery, and certainly would have some amphorae for storing liquids. Next slide. We can illustrate this best from graves. These are graves from a Roman cemetery just outside Winchester in southern Britain. You can see the pots, which are in red. Those are pots like the ones that I was showing you earlier. But also, I hope you can see, at the corners of each grave, there are nails. These people were buried in wooden coffins, banged together with nails. And pointed out by the red arrows are little collections of metal studs, which are the studs from Roman shoes with iron studs. And you can see top right, a Roman shoe with an iron stud that's actually been preserved. So these people here buried have access to coffins knocked together with nails, and the nails are essentially essential for making the coffins. They've got access to good quality pottery, and they've also got access to shoes with studs. And these are very ordinary people. There is nothing special about these graves at Lank Hills. And this is the point I really want to make, that basically the Roman economy reaches very deep down in society. It's actually producing good quality goods for ordinary people. How was this achieved? Firstly, unquestionably, through a high degree of specialization of labor. People could work full-time as potters in order to produce the sort of quantities and quality that we see. Unfortunately, as I said, we don't have much written evidence, but fascinatingly, the next slide, we have a text by a Christian author, by St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, which actually tells one a remarkable amount about specialization of labor in the Roman Empire. He's actually talking about the pagan gods. And as you probably know, in the Roman pagan times, individual gods looked after different aspects of your life. Whereas, of course, the Christian God said he could do absolutely everything and you didn't need the individual gods. And Augustine is making fun of the individual gods of pagan times. And I'll read it to you. Indeed, we laugh when we see them, that is, the pagan gods, distributed by the fancies of human opinions to particular works. In other words, doing particular things for you. I mean, Venus, for instance, looked after your love life. And he compares them to workmen, like workmen in the street of the silversmiths, where one vessel, so that it may go out perfect, passes through many craftsmen when it might have been finished by one perfect craftsman. He's saying Christian God could do it all. You don't need these many craftsmen. But the reason why a multitude of workmen was thought necessary was so that individual workers could learn individual parts of an art quickly and easily, rather than that they should all be compelled to be perfect in one entire art, which they could only attain slowly and with difficulty. I mean, Augustine is describing the specialization of labor. I mean, exactly as Adam Smith was to describe it in the 18th century. It's chance that we happen to have this description, but it's a lovely example of how actually, the Roman economy was sophisticated, with people doing different jobs in order to produce single items. So the specialization of labor. Next slide. There's also extremely efficient transport systems. The Romans built roads, as I'm sure you know, so overland transport was revolutionized in Roman period, and they had a very effective waterborne transport system, helped by the fact that the Mediterranean in particular was entirely at peace. There is no piracy active in the later Roman period. And we know about some of this transport from underwater archaeology. And this is a wreck off the south coast of France. And you can see that it's filled with Italian, we know they're Italian from the shape of the vessels, Italian wine amphorae, which have been very carefully stacked up in order to fill up that wreck. So there's an extremely good transport system. Next slide. And there is widespread and extensive monetization. Barter, of course, can be used for exchange, but there's no doubt that coinage, helps it greatly. In the case of barter, you have to trust that the person you're bartering with will give you what you want, unless they can give it to you immediately. But with coin, you can just take coin off them and you can spend your coins wherever you want. It's a much simpler and far more efficient way of running an economy. The Romans produced coins by their million. And we know quite a lot about this now, particularly from Britain, because in Britain, there are lots of metal detectorists going around finding Roman coins. And fortunately, Britain has a scheme called the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which says it's fine to go and find a Roman coin, except on a protected site. You can go and do metal detecting. It's perfectly legal, as long as you're not doing it on a protected site. But they encourage you to take the coin into a local museum, and then the local museum will record the coin, probably photograph it, probably weigh it, and they'll give it back to you. If it's a very special and very interesting coin, they might try and buy it off you. But as a result, and then the local museums log into a central database. And so we have a very, very, very full picture of coin use in places like Britain. So that all these red dots are one particular coin of one emperor. They're copper coins is discovered in Britain. What this Roman economy supported then, in terms of wider society, is impressive. Next slide. This is Pompeii, south of Naples, which was, as I'm sure you know, engulfed by a volcanic eruption in 79 AD. And when you go to Pompeii, the thing that's striking about it is how remarkably sort of contemporary it is. It's got paved streets, as you can see here, with sidewalks. It's got brick and stone houses. Everything is built of solid brick and stone, and they all had tiled roofs. And it's got things like a public water supply. Rich people had piped water into their own homes. Everybody else got their water from public fountains, but these are regularly distributed around the city of Pompeii. and I would like to emphasize, Pompeii is not an important city. It's a perfectly ordinary Italian provincial city, which nobody would have heard of. This is typical. It's not exceptional. I mean, this is typical of Roman quality of life. And this quality of life can also be documented in the countryside. We don't have a Pompeii from the countryside. Next slide. But fortunately, in more northern Syria, there's an area called the Limestone Massif where people built in stone, and where fortunately the whole area was then abandoned and nobody has come along and stolen all the stones in order to build their own houses. So in fact, we have whole villages surviving more or less intact, as you can see in this slide. Impressive stone-built structures in a village context. So that ends the first part of my talk, and the longest part, because I think it's important, obviously, to illustrate and I hope prove the remarkable sophistication of the Roman economy. In the second part, we're going to look at what happens to this. Put very simply, it shrinks dramatically, and in some cases, more or less disappears. This is a much shorter part because it's much easier, because the story is essentially very simple. I mean, if we look at pottery, for example, next slide. You remember the pots that we saw from Winchester, from graves in Winchester. This is 5th century pottery from southern Britain, the same area of Britain. Extraordinarily, even the use of the wheel, which is the most basic technology for making pots, disappears in southern Britain in post-Roman times. These pots have been hand-shaped without the use of the wheel. The clay has been very badly selected. They have been, in some cases, decorated, but these are friable and very basic. No gloss, no painted decoration, totally different to what we saw earlier. Now, Britain is an extreme case. I mean, it's unusual that even the use of the pottery wheel disappears. Next slide. But in somewhere like Italy, you still have wheel-turned pottery, and it is functional, as you can see from these examples, but all the tablewares have completely disappeared. And actually, in terms of functionality and range of basic cooking pots, this is far, far, far less than you had in the Roman period. It's really quite a dramatic shrinkage in terms of production and therefore in terms of availability of goods to the wider public. The same is true of iron. In the Roman period, people used nails extensively, and nails are extremely useful because they allow you to bang two bits of wood together in a very, very short space of time with almost no effort. And then, because they're made of iron, they actually are durable. In the post-Roman period, people had to either make a joint in order to get two bits of wood together, or possibly use a wooden peg. But a wooden peg, of course, is far less durable than a nail. So, I mean, iron too becomes much, much scarcer in the Roman period. The economy also unquestionably becomes less monetized. Next slide. There are some coins made. This, for instance, is a Frankish king in the mid-6th century minting a coin imitating Roman coinage. But in the post-Roman West, all the coinage is gold only. There is no copper coin minted. and extremely little silver coin. And gold coins arguably are being used primarily for political reasons, as gifts or as, tribute. The ordinary coins, the copper coins, which were the most useful coins for facilitating exchange at a local level, totally disappear. The sort of sophisticated lifestyle that we saw at Pompeii goes. Next slide. This is a site in Italy. It's an air photograph of the center of a Roman site. And you can see the stone buildings of the Roman period. All of those disappear. And this is the central forum, the central market square of the city. All of those disappear. All the marble is taken away, and the area is covered in silt. And in the 6th century AD, wooden houses are built over that abandoned forum. And the little drawing is of one of these 6th century wooden houses. A lot of cities totally disappear. For instance, in post-Roman Britain, there are no towns surviving. They all go. And towns only begin to return to Britain in the 7th and 8th century. Next slide. It's possible that there is a huge population decline, but this is very difficult to prove. It shows up archaeologically. This is the result of field survey north of Rome. With field survey, what you do is you walk over ploughed fields and you pick up bits of pot. And bits of pot, concentrations of them, show a settlement. And from the Roman period, it's very easy to trace these settlements because they show up very clearly from lots and lots of bits of pot and tile and stuff scattered around. And this is the result of field survey north of Rome. And the empty circles are rich aristocratic sites, but just as significant, all the little black dots are ordinary farmsteads with no sign of aristocratic settlement. Densely settled in the Roman period. That's in the 1st century AD. And the next slide. Whereas the evidence from the 5th and 6th century is much more scattered and far less dense. There is a problem here because the way we find these settlements is from the things that have been left behind, in particular, the pottery. And if, as I've shown, in the 5th, 6th century, many less things are available, then, of course, even if people were there and were living in wooden houses using very little pottery or even no pottery at all, they just wouldn't show up. So it's actually extremely difficult to prove population decline, but I think it's actually quite likely. I don't know that we ever will be able to prove it because of this difficulty with the archaeological evidence. Is the lack of things a sign of lack of people or just a sign of lack of things? Next slide. In my book of 2005, I did something rather foolhardy, certainly brave, and I produced some simplified, possibly simplistic graphs showing the different scale and pace of post-Roman economic collapse. I did, of course, say these are very simplified, possibly simplistic in the text. And what I want you to look at is the middle, the upper graph. And these are 3 areas: North Africa, North and Central Italy, and Britain. And in the case of North Africa and North and Central Italy, the decline is steady and quite undramatic and reaches a certain level. Now I should explain the vertical axis, I'm sorry, it's not showing up here, is the top of it just says considerable and the bottom of it says minimal. and it's talking about considerable economic sophistication and minimal economic sophistication. Wonderfully vague. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at a modern economy, you would expect something slightly more concrete than considerable sophistication or minimal sophistication. But you're going from, in North Africa, from considerable economic sophistication to something pretty low down, around 700 AD. The lower, the dates are along the bottom. In Britain, a much more dramatic change that takes you even further down and rather faster, and North and Central Italy, something sort of more like North Africa. Now, I don't claim that those graphs, represent the absolute truth, and I think almost certainly, if one had more data, one would find that there were drops, slight revivals, further drops, slight revivals, and whatever. They wouldn't be these nice, smooth lines. But interestingly, and I'm quite surprised because this came out in 2005, nobody has written a detailed critique of what I present here. Essentially, it's been accepted by those who are interested in the thing. A lot of people just ignore it, just go on talking about late antiquity as a period, of no change at all. They just ignore it. But there hasn't been a detailed critique of this. Finally, I want to explore the scale of the decline. Is it the case, for instance, in Britain, that you just go back to immediately pre-Roman Britain? I mean, Britain was invaded by the Romans in 43 AD. Do you just go back to that? No, is the answer. You go back much further in economic terms. Next slide. Pre-Roman Britain had more sophisticated objects than immediately post-Roman Britain. This is a chieftain's grave of the late 1st century BC from a place called Welin. And what you can see here at the back are Roman amphorae. Then there are some fairly basic pots, which are probably also imported. But the pots at the front in black are locally made. And they are made on a wheel with well-selected clay, and they have this black glazed gloss on them. This is far more sophisticated than what you have in the immediately post-Roman period, which I showed you earlier. Next slide. And I've not published this, but I think if you look at pottery, you can sort of suggest how far back the economy was cast in the post-Roman period. This picture here is pottery from a site in southern Britain, a hill fort. And this is at the top, pots of the 6th century BC, in the middle, pots of the 4th, the 2nd century BC, and at the bottom, pots of the 1st century BC. The ones at the top are made without the use of the wheel, and as you can see, are pretty basic. The ones in the middle are almost all made without use of the wheel, do have a little bit of decoration, but do represent a degree of sophistication above the ones at the very top. And then the ones at the bottom are rather like the pots that we were looking at in that chieftain's grave, which include wheel-turned pottery and also some imported material. Next slide. On this next slide, I've taken the pots that I showed you from Canterbury alongside, and I suggest that that's 5th century AD pottery. I suggest it roughly equates to the 4th to 2nd century BC pottery from this prehistoric site. So if that is a reliable indicator, the end of Roman Britain didn't just cast the economy back to immediately pre-Roman times, it actually cast it deep into prehistory, into the 4th and 2nd century BC. And alongside this, there is also a dramatic social change. Next slide. Because I mean, towns are abandoned, and instead what happens is, in fact, the prehistoric hill forts, this is one in Somerset in southern Britain, are reoccupied. I mean, excavation has shown that this was resettled in the 5th century AD. Huge, huge change. Why is much debated. I mean, I personally think it's the disruption that comes with invasion, with civil war, and the oncoming of a degree of political chaos. But that is debated. But the lesson that it has for us, and this is where I'm going to end my talk, is that we should not be complacent. One of the reasons why the Roman economy, I think, goes back to deep BC levels is precisely because it had become sophisticated. People were used to buying pots that were made hundreds of kilometers away by skilled craftsmen whose livelihood depended on their ability to make lots and lots of pots and sell them over hundreds of kilometers. In other words, people are locked into a complex market economy with a considerable specialization of labor, a transport system which works perfectly, and with mechanisms of exchange that work. Roman economy had developed that. So sadly for them, when the circumstances that enabled that to continue functioning ended, they're actually thrust back to levels of economic complexity that are far, far worse, because the local markets, the local potters, the local people making small amounts of things for a very small local market have gone. They've been replaced by these massive conglomerates, international conglomerates, and the result is disaster. So the lesson is, I'm not saying I think our economy is about to collapse. I hope it isn't, but we do need to be aware of quite how fragile the extraordinarily complex structures that we've created in order to support, our own well-being are, and not just take them for granted. I think we tend to assume that economic complexity will just continue and continue. The end of the Roman Empire shows that it can collapse, and that's a lesson that we ought to take to heart. I'm going to stop there. I'm very happy to take any questions from anyone. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Not sure what happens now, but I will wait. Pradip, are you there? I think we may have lost our chairman, so it may be, but I think we'll wait a few minutes and see what happens. I can't see him on my screen, and he didn't answer when I said, "Are you there?" So, but we will have to wait and just see. And apologies.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I was disconnected. So,
Yes, sir.
হ্যাঁ আচ্ছা কোনো প্রশ্ন, is there any question? You can put the questions here. In the meantime, I want to ask Professor Bryan Ward-Perkins. May I ask my question?
Of course.
Yes. You wanted to show that economic reason was played a very crucial role
Yes.
behind the fall of the Roman Empire. I have seen that a few scholars are engaged in a kind of debate that it was not a collapse of the Roman Empire, it was not a fall. Actually, it was a kind of transformation of uh, culture, cultural transformation of a very influential type. So, can we say that the Roman Empire collapsed because of economic failures?
Oh, okay. Sorry, there are actually, in a way, two things there. One, why did the Roman Empire collapse? Was it because of economic failure? And the second thing is, was there a major transformation economically? The second one, I've already produced my arguments, which is to say, yes, there is a really major economic transformation, and it's impossible to deny. I mean, literally, if you talk to any archaeologist, they will agree with me. You have to be a historian with no interest in material culture and no engagement with things like pottery to say that there is no economic change. But the first question is much more difficult. Was the collapse, was the failure of the Roman Empire due to its own economic decline before the invasions happened? Because what I'm arguing is that the invasions and the chaos of the invasions and the chaos of the civil wars and the disruption is what causes the economic collapse. I'm not arguing, I wasn't discussing what happens before the Roman Empire falls. Now, it is possible to argue for economic decline in the pre-invasion period, and economic decline would have a significant military impact because the Roman state was, like our states, a taxing state, and it paid for a professional army with the money that it raised from tax. So if the economic situation was getting worse, the tax base would have been declining, and the army would have been getting less strong. That used to be argued, but actually archaeological work has shown that some provinces were probably declining in economically, in particular Italy, but other provinces like Britain, North Africa, and the eastern provinces were actually doing extremely well in the 4th century. And I think at the moment people don't really think that an economic decline of the Roman state was important in bringing it down. Personally, I think it's just bad luck. Well, sorry, two things. I mean, the first thing, and I argue this in my book, the balance of power, military balance of power between the Romans and the people beyond the frontier was quite fine-grained. It wasn't that the people, the Romans had, machine guns. They had more sophisticated technology. They could build forts. They had weapon factories, which were able to produce weapons in large quantities. And they had organization and a structural organization also for, say, feeding troops, moving troops. That's one of the reasons they built their roads. But essentially, warfare consisted of people hitting each other with bits of metal. And it was essentially the same. It wasn't like the West Europeans sort of entering Africa and able to just totally dominate or the Spanish entering South America. It wasn't that the Romans had an immeasurable technological military advantage. And actually, of course, the Germanic people have been looking at the Romans for 300 years, and they'd probably got better militarily. So I think it's just, and then a series of things happen which happen to be bad luck. There are civil wars at the wrong time, and this, that, and the other. I mean, that's why I think the Roman Empire collapses. I don't think it's due to some innate deep weakness. And it's interesting that the Eastern Roman Empire survives, and there's a very obvious reason why that happens. Is there is, between the Black Sea and the Aegean, there is the Bosphorus running past Constantinople. There is a small stretch of sea, and the Romans had dominance of the sea. The barbarian peoples did not have good ships, and they were not, as it were, able to sail across the sea, at least not initially. And as a result, most of the East Roman Empire was actually untouched, whereas the West Roman Empire had no such advantage. So, I mean, that's why I think it happens. So I don't think, so economic collapse, I'm arguing for it after the beginnings of the Troubles, not as a cause of the Troubles.
Well, there is another question from Professor Partho Ganguly, but before that, I'll finish by asking you the last part of my question. That is, I don't know whether you were a Marxist or not, but you were giving emphasis on the economic factors. In Marxist historiography, we know that economic factors or the mode of production is considered to have played a very important role. Now, you see, if we measure in terms of the level of mode of production, then the Romans were building up a very prosperous mercantile capitalism or a proto-capitalism, you can say mercantile proto-capitalism in a very embryonic form, and the After the fall of the Roman Empire, we find that the medieval period did not have such manufacturing or trading activities. These were not at all developed during the Middle Ages. So the Romans could not compete with the less developed Teutonic tribes, Germanic tribes, Goths, Visigoths, etc. A higher economy, higher kind of mode of production failed before a lower kind of mode of production, and finally the result is medieval period, which is also a far lower kind of mode of production. So how should we understand the uh, Hegelian talks doctrine about the unilinear progress of history and Marxist historical materialism or Enlightenment, say Enlightenment historiography, that continuously human civilization is marching forward from a lower level to a higher level, and a lower level economic mode of production is continuously developing towards a higher level of mode of production. These very established uh, traditional or conventional historiography, these very basic premises, are they not going to be challenged by your research?
Yes, no, I would agree entirely. No, I'm basically saying there is no linear progress. You can have dramatic collapse. I mean that's the lesson I'm wanting people to realize, is that we've got. I mean, and it's essentially in the, well, it's to be true of India as well. I mean, we've got essentially for the last 500 years, we have enjoyed unilinear, greater. Well, I know in India, things like what the British do to the cotton workers. There have been some nasty things happen, but if you took the very, very broad trend, the broad trend is upwards towards greater sophistication, to the availability of goods to a wider and wider group in the population. And that's certainly for the last, well, in fact, really the last 1,000 years. So yes, that's what we've got used to. But what I'm saying is, remember, it can all come unstuck. And furthermore, precisely because it has become so sophisticated, if it were to come unstuck, it would be absolutely awful, because we've all forgotten how to make our pots. I mean, I wouldn't have the faintest idea how to make a pot. I rely on a pot that's come from China, probably, and that is a fragile system. So yes, I agree entirely on that. I'm not a Marxist, but as an archaeologist, you work with stuff produced by ordinary people quite low down the social scale, and I find that, I mean, I'm impressed by the stuff they do, and just it's the I mean, Roman pottery is nice to handle, and it's interesting, and I actually find that very, and I find things like bricks very, very interesting. A brick is it's a lot of historians don't care tuppence about a brick. I think bricks matter, and in fact, actually, I had a friend who worked in India, and he read my book and he said, I quite understand what you say about the importance of tiled roofs. A roof that doesn't rot, that doesn't have insects in it, and which will keep out the rain. Is a good thing. Romans had tiled roofs in abundance. Tiled roofs pretty much disappear in the post-Roman period. I mean, there are tiles. They have them in, palaces and on churches, but ordinary people just did not have access to tiles. So I'm not a Marxist, but I am very much in sympathy with people making and using ordinary things, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. There is another question. Uh, Prakash, should you please give the question here from Professor Partho Ganguly? Prakash, give the question here. Put the question here.
Okay, it's told the Roman dynasty was not built in a day. Is it yet to, in this contemporary world, the system was not built in a day and ultimately it destroyed help? Sorry, it's was not built in a day. Is it yet to, in this contemporary world, that system? I'm sorry, I'm struggling to understand the question. Yeah, I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, absolutely. Our system wasn't built in a day, but I mean, sorry, yes. I mean, system. I mean, I suppose I think I understand the question, and I mean, my answer is that yes, it takes a very long time to build up complex systems like this, and probably it takes a lot less time to totally destroy them. I mean, obviously, at the moment, what we're all worried about is climate change, and rightly so. But I mean, the most obvious catastrophe that would happen to us would be a major, major, major nuclear war, and arguably that would, disrupt our systems to the point that everything could collapse. I mean, I mean, obviously, something extraordinary like electricity suddenly failing. I don't think it's going to do that, but that would have the same effect. But I suppose it takes a long time to build up a complex system, but it probably takes a lot less time to destroy one. I don't know whether that's answered the question. That's my attempt at an answer. Yes, the system that runs today must have run like Roman civilization. Yes, I mean, I think, I mean, obviously, we live in a far more complex world. I mean, Roman communications is pretty basic. You still have to send a horseman in order to, and then a ship, and it takes, a week or several weeks, to cross the Mediterranean to bring in information. Equally, the question about capitalism came up. I don't really know enough about it, but I mean, Romans, for instance, didn't have sophisticated banking systems, and they didn't have sophisticated ways of storing wealth. They basically stored wealth by buying land. So it's, in modern terms, I mean, the Roman system is pretty, is hardly complex and developed. But on the other hand, it's very complex and developed in comparison to what had come before, and as I argue, to what happens immediately afterwards. Yes, okay. I'm afraid I don't know what platform capitalism is. I'm sorry, I'm actually a late antique historian, but certainly, I mean, globalization is dangerous just because actually, in a way, that's become pretty obvious recently. I mean, the US and Europe have sort of slightly woken up to the fact that getting absolutely everything made for them by people, well, particularly by the Chinese, is risky. And a war over Taiwan would be massively disruptive. And obviously, part of the diversification is the hope that India will represent an alternative to China. But yes, I mean, global economic activity is highly at risk. And the Romans show that. I mean, Rome, for instance, was fed from North Africa. North Africa falls to the Vandals in the 5th century. The grain supply to Rome ceases. I'm sorry, I missed that last question. I wasn't reading it. So you would argue against the extremely sophisticated technological advancement. Well, difficult. No, I mean, I'm a huge beneficiary of technological advancement dependent on people making it a very long way away and selling it to me very, very cheap. But it's risky. There is a risk. Which interestingly, the last 3 or 4 years, people have, I mean, it is an issue that actually has come up. I mean, obviously it's come up in a major way in the States, although that's largely about employment, but it's also about, the availability of stuff to make electric batteries. I mean, Europe's trying to persuade the Serbs to let us mine, is it lithium? I can't remember. I mean, it's very controversial in Serbia, but lithium is crucial for, yes, I mean, this is an issue. I mean, in a way, my talk supports current anxieties. Okay. Well, the East Roman Empire, well, I think the main reason it survives the 5th century crisis is this chance that there happens to be the Bosphorus, which keeps the people who are threatening at the time, the Germanic invaders, because actually the East Roman Empire fails to defeat them in the Balkans. The Balkans were part of the Eastern Roman Empire, and actually they failed totally in the Balkans, and the Balkans collapse. But what is modern Turkey, the modern Near East, sort of Israel, Lebanon area, Egypt, are all intact. So it's partly chance, I think, that they're able to survive then. They have a terrible crisis in the 7th century with the rise of the Arabs, because the Arabs suddenly burst out of Arabia in the 630s under the new banner of Islam, and they devastate the eastern provinces and very, very, very nearly collapse. I mean, the East Roman Empire could easily have collapsed at the beginning of the 7th century. It does hold on. It loses a lot of its power in the 7th century and never really recovers it. And actually, by 1453, the East Roman Empire is really just Constantinople. So it's a period of decline. I mean, the key thing in the 5th century, I think, is the chance that they're protected from the Germanic people. And in the 7th century, they happen to manage to resist the Arabs. They could easily have gone under. I mean, it's also true that, you can argue that the West Roman Empire, it could have defeated the Germanic peoples. It wasn't impossible. It so happens that they didn't. I mean, it is, I mean, anything is possible. Hang on. I mean, what explains the survived Eastern Roman for approximately 1,000 when the situation was not conducive? Oh, okay. No, I mean, I don't think the situation in the East is that they have a sophisticated economy. It's not disrupted by war in the 5th century. They do fine, and they maintain a professional army. Their crisis, as I say, it happens in the 7th, 8th century. What lessons can be learned from the fall of the Roman Empire? Well, what I hope, I mean, one lesson is let's not be complacent about the situation we're in. I don't know. I mean, the other lesson is, the one thing that you absolutely learn from history is that everything goes up and down. You cannot, and people tend to assume that if it's all good, it's going to go on being good, and that's just not true. Politically, it's not true. Militarily, it's just not true. I think that's the main lesson. I don't think there was anything. I mean, well, actually, one of the very interesting things about the end of the Roman Empire, which I don't think is emphasized enough, is it's quite unlike modern empires. Modern empires have all disintegrated or collapsed because people wanted to get out of them, like the Indians wanted to get out of the British Empire, and people in African colonies wanted to get out of the British Empire. That's been the primary reason for the decline of modern empires. Interestingly, the Roman Empire had actually successfully Romanized the people that it conquered, so that there's very, very little evidence that people were trying to get out. That's not what brings it down. It's external forces that bring it down. It's not liberation movements within the empire. Now, I'm being asked, how did the fall of Rome impact the modern world? Oh, okay, well, that's a very big question. If the Roman Empire had continued, Europe, would not just be the European Union, a loose conglomeration of states. It would be a single state. It would be a very large entity comparable to the USA or comparable to modern China, modern India, a massive collection of peoples. It has been argued, and I think there is a case for this, that the rise of Europe in the sort of 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century might not have happened if the Roman Empire had continued, because this is the argument that the rise of Europe happens because the Europeans have broken up into separate states and then they're all competing. So in fact, they're all developing military technologies against each other, and also people are able to move from one state to another if they think that their technology can be better exploited somewhere else. And that's possible. I mean, that is possible. I mean, that's a sort of one view. I mean, maybe if the Roman Empire had continued, it might have been a bit more like China, quietly chugging along, developing technology, but not really exploiting it very much, and not being so desperately competitive and not so, passionate about, asserting power elsewhere. I mean, it might be, there is an argument that, it would be more like the history of China.
Prakash, any more questions?
No, well, can I just say thank you for some very
No, sir.
interesting, demanding questions. It's great to put the Roman Empire into the world of the Enlightenment and what would have been different, things that we don't normally think about. So I'm actually very grateful for the questions.
Prakash, any more questions? Or do we conclude here?
Sounds like we're all
কোনো
exhausted.
প্রশ্ন নেই।
আচ্ছা, তাহলে let us conclude here, okay? So
That's fine, that's good.
thank you, Professor Bryan, Ward-Perkins. Thank you so much for your time, for your labor. You have been with us. We are so grateful to you, and for this brilliant elaboration of the particularly economic factors. You wanted to draw our attention to this factor. And thank you, Prakash, And thank you, the audience, everyone, everybody in the audience. Thank you so much. And this recording will be uploaded on YouTube within a few days. And I will send you the links again. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Pradip, for inviting me. It really has been a great pleasure, and it's been very good for me to have to think about these really big problems, because we just tend to take them all for granted and not think about them. So it was great. Thank you. I will leave.
Santona has said, thank you, sir, for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this webinar.
Oh, and Santana, you were the person changing the slides. Thank you very much for that.
Okay. So we leave, huh?
Okay, I will leave the studio now.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, sir.